Welcome to this week's OK at Work with myself, Sarah Sawyer, and my colleague, Russell Berger, both attorneys at Offit Kurman. And today we are talking about employees who are in multiple jurisdictions on a regular basis. So I know on episodes before we've talked about having a lot of different employees in different states and maybe you've got some work from home employees in one state and you've got a home base somewhere else and, having to comply with a lot of different laws. But in a lot of industries, there's also employees who are traveling to different states for their job on a daily basis, whether it's like in logistics or for various other reasons, delivery drivers, whatever it might be. What are some things that employers need to think about when that's the case, when they're originating from the same place, but might be going to multiple different states?
Yeah, well, the first point worth considering is that someone can be an employee for purposes of state laws in multiple different states. So while you might have one answer for taxes and withholding purposes and how you set them up in your payroll system, especially in this area where people cross state lines all the time, whether it's the DMV area or up into Pennsylvania, Delaware. There are a lot of crossing of state lines. And if you spend enough time in certain states, that person can become an employee for various statutory purposes within that state. So, for example, in Washington, D.C., there are laws that provide mandatory leave and anti-discrimination protections and all sorts of required notices and benefits. And in at least some of those laws, the DC law actually has written in a threshold for when someone becomes an employee, and it's not full time. So you could be based in Maryland, but spend a substantial enough amount of time in DC, and that person could then be a DC employee as well. And while we've talked about here having to comply with state laws in multiple different states, the added wrinkle here is that that may be true with just one employee.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's an interesting issue because I think that a lot of times too that folks will input this information because there's a lot of different layers, right? There's the taxes you need to pay. There's different types of payroll compliance and things that on a state by state basis, as far as like, oh, I need to follow these state rules or provide this leave or whatever it might be. And a lot of folks will say, well, I gave the information to my payroll company and my payroll company is considering them a Maryland employee. Okay, well, did you tell your payroll company that they also travel to Ohio every day? And back, and then they're back to Maryland? Have they considered that? And really, you might think the box is checked when it's not, right? You might say, okay, well, this is a simple equation. I know that they always show up to work in Maryland, so we're fine. And then that's the end of the story. And it really isn't. And so I think really a big piece of advice here is to dig a little bit deeper. And anytime that you have someone going to another state on a regular basis, it really is important to look into not just, well, am I paying taxes appropriately, but also, these other things. Are there other laws that I need to be compliant with? And it really is going to depend state by state. And DC is a great example, but the thresholds of how much time is spent where is different for every different state. Likely.
Right. Well, so there's no easy common answer, of course. The other wrinkle and place to think about this is with hybrid workers. So you may have an office in DC and have a worker that lives in Maryland, and they might split their time. And so while they're not necessarily showing up to work in the same office and then traveling out wherever they may go on a regular basis, they could spend 2 days a week in one jurisdiction and 3 days a week another, and that could trigger these obligations as well. So, from my perspective, what an employer ought to do is just identify situations where you have employees that are working in multiple different states or jurisdictions on a regular weekly basis, and then start refining it down from there. Figuring, okay, what states are in play? What different laws are there that I'm worried about? What are the thresholds, whether it's in statute or case law, that would make someone an employee for purposes of these various laws that I'm trying to comply with, and just work from there. But the real key starting place is, do I have employees that are working in multiple states on a reoccurring basis?
And there's some areas that have more robust precedent on these things as well because of the likelihood of people going between two jurisdictions. So for instance, New York and New Jersey is a really good example where their legislatures and local jurisdictions have thought through this very thoroughly because it's a very common occurrence for people to be living in one place and commuting to the other and working in both, especially since COVID and, since remote work has become so prominent. So some jurisdictions might not really have thought these things through, and there may not be clear-cut answers on where those limits are. But in these highly metropolitan areas where a lot of that is happening, those jurisdictions definitely know it's happening, and there's definitely strong rules on what you should be doing there. So that's also something to consider if you're in any of those areas for sure. Well, thanks, Russell, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Sarah.